With so much discussion around the release of Bruce Banner centering around how it allows us to save for future spotlights, let's take a look at the exciting cards coming out in Marvel Snap's February Captain America Brave New World season, because these are going to be some of the cards that you might be saving for. First up is Sam Wilson, Captain America himself. He is going to be the season pass card per Datamines on this season, and that makes a lot of sense. I trust it, even though Datamines have been typically, mostly reliable, but not 100% reliable. It makes perfect sense to have Sam Wilson be the season pass card. He's also, in my estimation, one of the most interesting cards we've ever seen in Marvel Snap. His text says, game start, create Cap's shield on the board, and his ability is an ongoing one that gives Cap's shield the ability to move. But what's Cap's shield? Cap's shield is a 1/1 with an ongoing ability that says it can't be destroyed. Sorry, Killmonger. This also has an additional ability that when it moves to Cap's location, and I believe, as far as I'm aware, that refers to both Sam Wilson and Captain America, the one in the game currently, this will give that card +2 power. This is awesome flavoring. I really love how this actually works, where it's like, okay, this shows up on the board at the beginning of the game. I play my Sam Wilson, which is ongoing, by the way. I play my Captain America. I start throwing the shield back and forth between them. They're throwing the shield back and forth, getting stronger, being beefy guys together. I think that's awesome. All three of these cards, if you include, of course, Captain America, the Series 1 card, this is all an ongoing synergy deck. So you have like maybe a Spectrum in there. You have the ability to do a bunch of unique stuff. There's another interaction with Cap's shield that I think is kind of interesting, and that's Kraven the Hunter. So now you have Sam and Kraven the Hunter chucking the shield back and forth and getting stronger and stronger and stronger. I think this stuff is kind of interesting. I wonder if maybe we can look into, like, I don't know, Hercules. I doubt it, but it's a possibility. But what I really want this to do is to give ongoing a boost that it needs. One of the things that I've talked about for a very long time is how unwilling it seems like the Marvel Snap devs are to push power into ongoing cards in the same way that they're willing to push power into stuff like Surtur and Agent Venom. And Sam Cap is a very good example of what it would look like to push power into an ongoing card. This card creates a 1/1 on the board for free. It is a free 1/1. It is Patches the Pirate. We know how good that's been in other games, but in games like Marvel Snap, it tends to be less good because of the ways in which this game cares a lot about filling up your board, about having the correct amount of points per board space, about the ratio between the amount of points you have and the amount of points you're able to put on the board, and about how easy it can be to fill up the board with 1/1s. That's not actually a very hard thing to do. What this 1/1 does is have an ongoing ability, synergy with Spectrum, and have built-in synergy with Cap and Sam. When you get your Cap and your Sam, you're chucking the shield back and forth. It's extremely cool. And this also has synergy with Baseline Cap because it's an ongoing card, and Baseline Cap buffs ongoing cards. So both of these will get a buff from Baseline Cap if for some reason you feel the need to play Cap late and you're not going to be able to send them back and forth. You can put it in Sam's lane and get a buff on Sam because the ability to move is part of his ability and it is an ongoing ability. I think this is a great direction for them to go, frankly. I have talked ad nauseum about how unwilling they seem to be to push power into ongoing and how little that makes sense. Because ongoing, as a sort of center of power, is the thing that we have the most answers for. We have way more answers to ongoing stuff that has to be on the board to start doing what it does. That has Rogue, has Enchantress, has Red Guardian. All of that stuff is stuff we can deal with and have dealt with. Ongoing is probably the least problematic place for them to put power because there are so many answers to it and because it has to be on the board. That means that there is a lot that this card I think can do, but it's going to take a while before it has what I would view as a competent supporting cast before we can start looking at ongoing as the center of a good card's deck. I personally think that this is an extremely exciting card, an extremely interesting card, but I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't manage to land. Or if it does land, it'll be as part of a package. Like, for example, you're playing Sam and Cap in another deck that's already running Kraven. Or you're playing Sam and Cap in your Wiccan deck that's doing some things that are kind of related to it, but it's really more of a sub-theme than it is anything else. But what I really want this to do is to make Spectrum ongoing decks good again. And I think that one of the things that I've learned watching design iterate on stuff in Marvel Snap and what my favorite seasons are and what the seasons that people seem to like are, is that one thing I think that this card gets really right is synergizing with a lot of Series 1 and 2 cards explicitly, as opposed to synergizing with later Series 4 and 5 cards. And that's another reason, actually, why putting power into ongoing is such a good idea, because it makes cards like this, a season pass, such a better pickup for someone who is in the early stages of the game. This is gonna make their Spectrum deck good, and it might even scale into the late game as a sub-theme in powerful mid-range decks. I cannot say enough good things about this card. I think it is an excellently designed card, but I do think it'll probably land relatively low until it gets the support that it needs. But I also hope that I'm wrong. And when I say relatively low here, I mean expectations for this card are sky high. I think it'll be a good card, a solid card, rather than, oh my god, it's the best card ever. And I think that'll be like more like a 7 or an 8 than a 9 or a 10. But that's still a really good card. Joaquin Torres takes up the mantle of Falcon. So not only do we have a new Captain America in Sam Wilson, we have a new Falcon and Joaquin Torres. And like the previous Sam Wilson Falcon, it actually has synergy with a different kind of, or a specific card type that is one cost cards. And I don't know if this is enough to make me want to do it. Like, this is a card that I can see being very good in the world where you're getting a second hood, right? But when you look at things that are getting you a second hood, you are mostly looking at bounce cards, right? And those bounce cards get you a second hood and also pick up the card. So the competitive advantage of this card is that it gets you the second hood faster and then leaves you the ability to pick up the card again later. Like, there's a world where you go like hood into this, into beast, into hood, into this, and that's awesome. But that seems like a lot of hand management that is really problematic to actually do. I feel like this card wants another one drop that is really worth doing that with. Silver Sable, Rocket Raccoon, these are cards that go in bounce. But I also worry that the bounce deck is so set in terms of the power it has that this might not make it in there. I will tell you, though, there is a thought that I had about this card repeating Iron Fist stuff that is not lost on me. The move bounce deck is kind of interesting in that a lot of the one-cost cards that it has, it does not care about repeating, but two of them, Iron Fist and Ghost Spider, really cares about repeating. I don't think this card is going to be very good at repeating Ghost Spider. Maybe it could be. But repeating Iron Fist is actually very good. I just don't know if it's worth running a 3-3 good. I wonder about this guy. Could he be a contender for a late buff? Is he the kind of card that needs other cards to be good even if he gets that late buff? If he came out at 3-5, I feel like he'd be pretty obviously pushed, but also he'd probably have a higher chance of actually going into the decks that he seems to want to go into. I feel like a 3-5 version of this would really make me reevaluate what I want to be doing in bounce. Whereas the 3-3 version of this is not making me reevaluate that at all. One of the things that's really interesting about bounce right now is we're not even really guaranteed to be playing Sam Wilson Falcon. And Sam Wilson Falcon basically does this, but a little bit better in terms of how it works in practice, because it costs one less, has the same amount of power, and actually takes that hood off of the board, which is really important. I don't know. I don't necessarily see it for this card. Maybe if it were a 2-3, maybe if it were a 3-5, but either way, I think it's hard for me to justify fitting this into a bounce deck that is already constrained both on points, or not necessarily on points, but in terms of hand size, in terms of board space, and in terms of like just generally how much energy it has to devote to things that are not bouncing. And I think that's probably the limiter that I see as being the most impactful here is this card costs a lot, and while the output is good if you have the hood, or if you hit like a Silver Sable and a Rocket Raccoon, all that stuff, that is good, but is it better than actually bouncing them? Because we have three great bouncers right now. We have Beast, we have Toxin, we have Falcon. And all of those probably seem like they go in this deck before Joaquin Torres does. General Thaddeus Thunderbolt Ross, when I look at this card, I get a little bit scared. This is a 2-2 with the ability to, when your opponent ends a turn with unspent energy, put a 10 power card in your hand. I mean, this seems like a born winner in Surtur decks. This is like absolute gasoline because that deck really just wants to get to Scar and play its guys that make Scar cheaper. This card punishes you for ever doing anything that isn't directly on curve by making that deck much more consistent. I can also see this working in Thanos type stuff. Thanos is already pretty heavy on the draw, and with Stones and Thad, I can see a lot of interesting stuff happening. This card strikes me as fairly strong in anything that is willing to actually play it. I look at this card and I get genuinely a little bit worried. I think downside-wise, well, it's a 2/2, it gets Red Guardians, it's, your opponent has control over whether or not you get any value out of it. But I do think that even if this draws just one card, 2/2 draw a relevant card, is an extremely powerful thing to be doing. So if it draws basically just one card between the time it's played and the time turn 6 starts, this card is paying for itself, and I personally think it'll probably be worth running in a wide variety of those decks. I think this card is strong. I realize that it's a little bit difficult in the immediate release of Bruce Banner to look at a card like this and be like, wow, that's going to be really good. It does have a Red Guardian problem, but it's also just a generically good thing to be doing. Granted, if they're going to be Red Guardianing this, it means they're probably not going to be Red Guardianing your Surtur. There's stuff here that makes a lot of sense. Plus, in addition, the decks that play the 10s right now typically play Squirrel Girl, which makes them a little bit harder to Red Guardian and makes this guy a little bit harder to Red Guardian. Squirrel Girl turn 1, play this in a lane with a Squirrel turn 2. You're not Red Guardianing it. It's probably drawing me some cards. I'm getting that Cull Obsidian. That's the reason I play it. If I'm playing it in Thanos, the stones will protect it as well. I think there's a lot to be said for this card, frankly. This is an interesting card that I consider very dangerous, and I think it's a legitimately powerful card. I think also in the wake of Bruce, I'm glad they didn't go for another transforming gimmick here, where this card would transform into Red Hulk, because, I mean, spoiler alert, General Thaddeus Thunderbolt Ross is Red Hulk, and that is why they have the same energy skip mechanic on them. But the real point here is this card is pretty scary as is, and I would not want to tack on a transform in addition to it. A good value accruing card that I think people will... I don't think people are going to properly place the blame on this card when they lose, but they should. Like, they're going to lose to this card more than they're going to be willing to admit they lost to this card. They're going to blame the 10s, they're going to blame Surtur, they're going to blame Scar. This card's going to be the reason that deck is going to be more efficient than it currently is, and I think it's a real boost to the archetype. Speaking of real boosts to the archetype, Red Wing. Return one of your other 1-cost cards here to your hand and give it +2 power. This card is sick. This is so cool. This is just Bounce Forge. It's a forge that you bounce again. We've had a 1/2 that gives +2 in bounce before. It was called Forge, and it was too strong. This is awesome. I can't wait to play with this card. I find it very hard to believe that it does not end up being a very good card in bounce. A repeatable 1/4 that is just awesome. Something I'm always going to be interested in. Bouncing this card is going to be sick because then it bounces some other stuff and gives it that power. It clears up lanes that get clogged up. It's an additional bouncer in a deck that has a bunch of really good ones already, but it's targeted specifically at 1-cost cards, so it's not going to be impossible to play on the final turn of the game, the way stuff like Toxin and Beast can be. Just great. I have absolutely nothing bad to say about this card. I do think that it is notably worse than Forge when we had it at 1 cost, because Forge at 1 cost had no real issues with sequencing. This card does have issues with sequencing. It is going to send that card back to hand, so it is worse on turn 6 than Forge. Forge was basically always just a 1/4 that would accrue value over the course of the game, a 1/4 that got +2 every time you bounced it effectively. And this card is sort of that, but not really that, because it's not able to be used on turn 6. It needs you to be doing stuff, but I think this card is very strong, and there's a lot of, like, I guess, fairly mediocre cards being played in normal bounce right now. And I'm not saying they're bad or anything like that, but like there's a reason that move bounce has overtaken normal bounce, and it's because with that level of consistency, the move bounce cards simply go taller, they have bigger numbers, and bounce has been a deck that has been roughly the same core for a very long time. Like, yes, it got Agent Venom, but it's been roughly the same, like, oh, I'm making a bunch of 6s, I'm playing, hit monkeys, whatever. It's been that for a while now. Like, the cap on what it can do has been roughly the same. And this is a card that raises that ceiling in a way that is relevant, because bounce is always a ceiling deck. And so any card that is able to be a 1-cost card that raises the point ceiling of bounce is really relevant and important because it is so generally unable to do that without the influx of new cards, because the deck is always going to be built a certain way. So I think this card is going to be important for making bounce a more relevant threat in the metagame, because what matters for bounce is being meaningfully able to go over the top of stuff. And as the metagame has gotten stronger and stronger and stronger with new cards coming out, the relative advantage that bounce had, because it hasn't really gotten anything, has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. Hence the turn to move bounce, which has a larger relative advantage when it pops off, but lower consistency. This adds power to bounce. It's still probably not going to be enough to overtake move bounce, but it adds power to bounce. Oh, and by the way, it buffs a Human Torch, so it's probably going in there too. Like, this is a really interesting card that I think raises some really interesting questions. I honestly do think it might be better in move bounce than bounce, because not only is it like, okay, I'm buffing Human Torch, but also I get to send back specific cards out of specific lanes, reusing Ghost Spider, reusing Iron Fist. That can be worth more than just a buff on Human Torch on its own. So basically, when I look at this card, I see a card that is good in normal bounce, but might be better in move bounce. All-star. All-star. Like, this is just a card that is going to be in those decks, as far as I can tell, forever. It's so sick. I gotta tell you, I did a double take when I saw this, because I was only familiar with Diamondback from the Netflix Luke Cage show, and that Diamondback did not look like this. But like, this is, I guess there's a different Diamondback that's also Luke Cage related, and I'm guessing this is Luke Cage related because of the way in which the ability interacts with Luke Cage. And this is where we start talking about like the general ability of a card like this to exist, because I expect that when this card comes out, it's going to suck. And it's not going to suck because it's bad or anything like that. It's going to suck because people are going to play Luke Cage. And then people are going to play Luke Cage not just because you want to play Luke Cage because people are playing Diamondback, but also because Luke Cage goes in the decks that are playing Diamondback in an ideal world. Remember when Anti-Venom came out and everyone and their mother was playing Luke Cage, and so you couldn't really play the Ajax version of the Anti-Venom deck, but now, months later, that is the best version of the deck, because of course it is when everyone isn't playing Luke Cage. I kind of expect the same kind of thing to happen with Diamondback, where it's like, there's a very obvious best, like, platonic ideal of what this card wants to be and what that deck looks like, but until people stop playing Luke Cage and everything, we're just not going to have room to play it. We're going to be in that weird metagame where, like, Ronin Anti-Venom is better because it's not relying on Luke Cage for all of, or it's not relying on stuff that gets stopped by Luke Cage for all of its points. And it's like, that those kind of things happen. I think most times people come out with a like a big mean afflict card. Is what really happens is it's just Luke Cage stonks go up for an extended period of time until people stop doing that. Right now, I personally think the Anti-Venom Luke Cage deck is like the best deck in the game. It'll probably be tomorrow's video. I have like a 72% win rate with it over like 50 games. It's been ridiculous for me, and it wouldn't have been ridiculous if everyone was still playing Luke Cage, right? And that is the kind of spot that this card is in. Diamondback having this multiple, like, it could be as big and as mean as a Man-Thing. As long as you have the Hazmat, this card is going to hit for like 11. Just a big, mean, beefy lady. It's just, you're going to get Luke Caged in week 1, and we're not going to have a good read on what this card is. This card is going to have the biggest week 1 syndrome of all time. I expect her to be a pretty good card, honestly, long term. But short term, she's going to get Luke Cage to absolute death. All right, y'all, I hope you enjoyed that look at the cards coming out in February. I'm pretty excited for a couple of them, especially Sam Wilson. Let me know in the comments which ones you're excited for. As always, I've been KM Best. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.